He slid the contract across the table like it was a death warrant, because it was. Adrian Voss didn't smile. Men like him didn't smile when they won. They just watched. His eyes tracked Elena Caldwell's face with the patience of someone who had practiced cruelty the way other men practiced piano, daily, deliberately, until it became second nature. The wedding hall hummed with expensive music and indifferent guests, and Elena sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap, and her jaw locked so tight she could feel her back teeth grinding. "Sign it," he said, "or I bury what's left of your father's name by morning." She looked at the contract, then she looked at him. And something in her chest, not fear, not quite, went very still. If this were you, what would you do? Walk away with nothing, or pick up the pen? Before we go further, if you're new here, welcome. Subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because you do not want to miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The rain had been coming down for 3 hours by the time Elena arrived at the Meridian Grand. She hadn't planned on being here. That morning, she'd been in the back office of what used to be her father's import company, now mostly empty, mostly debt, mostly memory, going through the final paperwork that the court had sent over. Liquidation notices, asset transfers. Her father's name, once printed on the building's brass plaque outside, was being removed that afternoon. She'd watched from the window as 2 men in gray coveralls took it down, and she hadn't cried, which surprised her because she'd expected to. She didn't know why she'd come to the Meridian. She told herself she'd gotten the invitation confused with something else. She told herself a lot of things. But the truth was simpler and uglier. She'd come because she had nowhere else to go, and standing still in that empty office felt like drowning on dry land. The wedding reception was for someone she barely knew, a distant business connection of her father's, one of those relationships maintained through obligatory Christmas cards and nothing more. But the invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago with her name on it, handwritten, and she'd kept it without knowing why. Now she stood at the entrance of the Grand's main hall in a dress that had once fit her better, clutching a small envelope with a gift card inside, and she felt immediately, overwhelmingly out of place. The hall was the kind of room where money announced itself without speaking. Crystal chandeliers, tables draped in ivory linen, champagne flutes catching light and throwing it back in small prismatic bursts. Elena had grown up in rooms like this. She knew how to walk through them, how to hold her glass, how to smile at people she didn't like and make them feel she was delighted to see them. She'd lost that skill somewhere in the last 5 years. It had gone quiet inside her, like a radio station slowly losing signal. She found a table near the back and sat down. She was reaching for the water pitcher when she felt it, that particular pressure of being watched, not casually, not the way strangers glance at each other in crowded rooms. This was the kind of attention that had weight to it, deliberate and unblinking, and it came from the far end of the hall. She looked up. Adrian Voss was already looking at her. She knew who he was. Everyone in Vespera knew who Adrian Voss was, in the same way everyone knew about weather patterns and power outages. Not because you sought the information, but because it was simply part of the atmosphere of the city. The Voss family had operated in Vespera's shadow economy for 2 generations. His father, Roland Voss, had built the empire from dock contracts and protection arrangements and the kind of handshake agreements that never appeared in writing. Adrian had inherited it at 29 when Roland died, or was pushed, depending on who you asked. And in the years since, he'd made it larger and colder and considerably more dangerous. He was 34 now. He didn't look like what people imagined when they imagined men like him. He was lean rather than imposing, with dark hair worn short and eyes the color of river water in winter. Not quite gray, not quite green, impossible to read at distance. He wore a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for him rather than bought off a rack, and he stood at the edge of the room's main gathering like someone who had attended the party only to survey it. He was still looking at her. Elena looked away first. She picked up the water glass and drank from it and concentrated very hard on the centerpiece, white lilies, overworked into 2 perfect arrangements, and told herself it meant nothing. It was 3 minutes before she felt someone pull out the chair beside her. She already knew who it was before she turned. "Elena Caldwell," Adrian said. Not a question, not a greeting, Just her name, stated as fact, the way you'd identify something you'd been waiting to find. She set the glass down. Mr. Voss? You look surprised. I'm not. She wasn't. She was frightened, which was different, and she had spent enough of the last 5 years being frightened that she'd learned to keep it below the surface. I'm just wondering what you want. He sat. He didn't ask permission, didn't perform any of the social niceties that the setting technically called for. He simply occupied the chair beside her with the ease of a man who had never once worried about whether he was welcome somewhere. I heard about the building, he said. The Caldwell import plaque. They took it down this afternoon. Her chest tightened. I'm aware of that. 11 million in outstanding debt. He said it the way someone would read from a grocery list. Not cruel exactly, but indifferent in a way that cut deeper than cruelty. 3 active lawsuits from creditors. And the estate's remaining assets, the house on Pembridge Lane, the storage units in the industrial district, 2 accounts at Harlow Federal, all frozen pending resolution. Elena turned to look at him directly. You've done your homework. I do my homework on anyone relevant to my interests. I haven't been relevant to anyone's interests in a long time. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. More like the acknowledgement that she'd said something that approached accuracy. You became relevant to mine about 6 weeks ago, he said, when I found out you'd been asking questions. The hall continued its noise around them. Toasts, laughter, the string quartet somewhere near the entrance working through something light and forgettable. Elena felt the bubble of it pressing against her, this ordinary world of celebration happening 6 feet from whatever this was. I don't know what questions you mean, she said. You visited the Vespera Records Archive on March 4th. You requested the financial transfer documents from the Caldwell-Voss joint venture, 2018 through 2019. The clerk who processed the request noted your name. He paused. You went back twice more. The second time, someone had already pulled the files. Not you. She hadn't known that. Her mouth went dry. Someone else is looking at the same material, she said slowly. That's one interpretation. What's yours? He didn't answer that. Instead, he reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and placed something on the table between them. It was an envelope, cream-colored, her name written on it in the same handwriting as the wedding invitation she'd received 2 weeks ago. She stared at it, then at him. You sent the invitation, she said. I needed to speak with you somewhere you wouldn't be suspicious. A wedding reception for people I barely know is supposed to be unsuspicious? You came, didn't you? She couldn't argue with that. She picked up the envelope, opened it. Inside was a single card, heavy stock, with 4 lines of text. The debt will be cleared, all of it, the lawsuit suspended, the remaining assets unfrozen, 1 year, legal marriage, name only. My attorney will contact you tomorrow if you agree tonight. Elena read it twice. She set it down on the tablecloth with the careful precision of someone who didn't trust their own hands. You're not serious, she said. I'm always serious. Marriage. The word felt strange in her mouth. To you, for a year. In name. You'll have your own rooms, your own schedule. I won't make demands beyond public appearances when business requires them. He glanced at the envelope. In exchange, the Caldwell estate's financial position is resolved entirely. You walk away at the end of 12 months with a clean start. And what do you get? His eyes met hers. A wife? That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving tonight. She looked at him for a long moment. The string quartet shifted to something with a minor key underneath it, barely audible but present. Elena thought about the empty office that morning, the plaque being taken down, the stack of legal notices on her father's old desk that she'd been moving from one side to the other for 3 weeks because she couldn't bring herself to actually file them. She thought about her father's face in his last weeks, the way he'd looked at her with something she'd read as exhaustion, but now, with distance, wondered if it had been guilt. My father trusted the wrong people, she said quietly. Not to Adrian, mostly to herself. Yes, Adrian said. He did. The simplicity of it, the agreement in it, made her look up sharply. His expression hadn't changed, but something in it was harder to decode now. There was no satisfaction there, no visible gloating, just that river water gaze watching her the way it had from across the room, patient and measuring. You blame my family, she said. I blame the people responsible. You think my father was responsible. I think there are things I don't know yet. That was a different answer than she'd expected, and it unsettled her more than hostility would have. She could navigate anger. She'd been navigating other people's anger at the Caldwell name for 5 years. But uncertainty coming from Adrian Voss was something else, something she didn't have a prepared response for. She looked down at the card again. 1 year. It was a trap. She wasn't naive enough to think otherwise. Men like Adrian Voss didn't offer clean exits to the daughters of men they considered enemies. There was something underneath this arrangement that he wasn't showing her, some architecture of intent she couldn't see from where she was standing. But $11 million in debt, 3 lawsuits. Her father's name dragged through every financial court in the city, and someone else had already been into those archives. Someone who had pulled the files before she could get to them. She picked up the card. She folded it once, carefully, and put it in her purse. I'm not agreeing tonight, she said. I didn't ask you to. I want to speak with your attorney before I sign anything. That's reasonable. And I want documentation, everything you're offering, in writing, before a notary, before any announcement is made anywhere. Also reasonable. He stood, straightening his jacket with a single unhurried motion. You're more careful than I expected. She looked up at him. You don't know anything about me. Something moved in his expression. Brief, almost invisible, but she caught it. Not dismissal. Something closer to reassessment. No, he said. Not yet. He left the way he'd arrived, without asking permission, without looking back, moving through the celebrating crowd as though it parted for him by natural law. Elena sat with her water glass and the ghost of that envelope and the noise of the party filling the space where he'd been. She stayed another 40 minutes because leaving immediately felt like admitting something. Then she went home to the apartment she was renting because the house on Pembridge Lane was frozen, sat down on the floor with her back against the couch, and tried to figure out what she'd just walked into. She called her father's old lawyer in the morning. He listened to what she described without interrupting, which was unusual for him. Gerald Marsh had built his career on strategic interruption, on filling silences with his own voice before they could become someone else's weapon. The fact that he went quiet told her more than anything he said afterward. Elena. His voice, when it came, had that particular flatness that professional men use when they're frightened of something they can't bill for. You need to be very careful. I know that. Adrian Voss isn't... He paused. She could hear him choosing words the way you'd choose footing on ice. He isn't someone you negotiate with from a position of equal standing. I know that too. Then you understand that whatever he's offering, Gerald... She stopped him. I need you to tell me something honestly. The original Caldwell-Voss joint venture, the documents from 2018 to 2019. Did my father do something wrong? The silence this time was longer. Your father made decisions under pressure, Gerald said finally. Some of those decisions had consequences he didn't anticipate. That's not an answer. It's the best one I have. He cleared his throat. What I can tell you is that if Adrian Voss is approaching you with an arrangement instead of a lawsuit, it means he wants something that a lawsuit can't give him. And whatever that thing is, it has nothing to do with money. She already knew that. She'd known it in the hall last night, watching him walk away. He wanted proximity. He wanted her somewhere he could control the terms of her existence, where he could watch her, where he could, what? Collect evidence? Extract information? Punish her slowly, in private, for sins she may or may not have committed on her father's behalf. Or something else entirely, something she didn't have enough information to name yet. She thanked Gerald and hung up and sat for a long time looking at nothing. Then she called the number on Adrian's attorney's business card. The contract arrived the following morning. It was 42 pages long and written in the kind of legal language that was designed to be impenetrable. But Elena had spent enough years in her father's office watching documents cross the desk that she could read it with reasonable comprehension. She went through it twice, marked 6 sections she wanted clarified, and called the attorney's office with her notes. What surprised her was that every change she requested came back approved within the hour. She'd expected resistance. She'd expected the negotiation to be a performance of power, Adrian yielding nothing, her accepting what was offered or walking away. Instead, he accepted her amendments without comment, and the revised contract arrived by 3 in the afternoon. She signed it at her kitchen table with a pen she'd taken from her father's desk, one of the few things she'd kept. It had his initials on it, RC, in small gold letters near the clip. She didn't look at them while she signed. The wedding was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Private ceremony, licensed officiant, 2 witnesses she didn't know. She wore a dress she'd owned for 3 years, pale gray, which she thought appropriate. Adrian wore charcoal. The officiant read the required words in a flat, professional voice. When the ring was placed on her finger, plain platinum, cold from Adrian's pocket, Elena kept her eyes level and her breathing steady and thought about nothing at all, which was a skill she'd been practicing long enough to have gotten good at. "You may kiss the bride" was replaced, at Adrian's prior specification, with "the ceremony is concluded." She'd been relieved by that change. She'd written it into her own list of amendments and hadn't expected him to accept it without negotiation, but he had, and she chose not to wonder too much about what that acceptance meant. Afterward, in the car taking them to the Voss estate, they sat on opposite sides of the back seat in silence. The city moved past the windows, wet streets, lit signs, the ordinary motion of people who had no idea what had just happened in a civil ceremony room 4 floors above street level. "I need access to the house's secure library," she said into the quiet. He turned his head toward her. "No." "The original joint venture documentation was stored there, my father's copies." "How do you know that?" "Because he told me. 3 weeks before he died, he told me he'd put copies of everything somewhere they wouldn't be found. The Caldwell copies of the original documents were destroyed in the office fire in 2019, but he said he'd given a second set to—" She stopped. Adrian's attention had sharpened to something she could physically feel. "To whom?" he said. "To someone he trusted." She looked at him directly. "He didn't say who." Adrian studied her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, but there was something working behind his eyes. The machinery of calculation, revising, resorting. "I'll consider library access," he said finally. "I need more than consideration." "You'll get what I decide to give you." She wanted to push back. She swallowed it. Not because she was afraid, or not only because, but because she was beginning to understand that with Adrian Voss, the argument you chose not to have now could become the advantage you used later. He expected resistance. He expected her to fight every inch. Whatever she gave him that looked like compliance was ground she could reclaim. She turned back to the window. The estate appeared at the end of a long private drive, stone walls, iron gate, grounds that in summer would be severe and geometric. In the early spring rain they were gray and graceless, all bone and no softness. Adrian got out without waiting for the driver to open his door. Elena got out on her side. They walked toward the entrance separately, not together, a 1.5 feet of distance between them that felt like much more. At the door he stopped and turned to look at her. "Your rooms are on the east wing, 3rd floor, he said. "Dinner is at 7. It's not required. Breakfast is at 7:30. "That one is." He held her gaze. "We'll maintain appearances in public. In this house, you don't have to perform anything." She nodded. He started to turn away. "Mr. Voss?" He stopped. She looked at him, really looked, past the composure and the careful blankness of his face, at the thing she'd been trying to identify since the wedding hall, the thing underneath the calculation. "You didn't bring me here to have someone to hate at close range," she said. "You brought me here because you need someone who was inside the same wreckage you were. Someone who might know things you don't." She paused. "I just want you to know that I know that, so we don't have to pretend otherwise." The house was silent around them. Rain moved against the windows. Adrian looked at her for a long moment with those river water eyes. "Get settled," he said. "Dinner's at 7. He walked away. Elena watched him go, then looked at the ring on her finger, plain platinum, no stone, cold even against her skin, and thought, 1 year. 365 days in a house with a man who thought she might be his enemy, looking for documents that might prove her father guilty, trying to find out who had been in those archives before her. She was inside the lion's den. She'd known that going in. What she hadn't known, what none of the contract's 42 pages had told her, what Gerald's careful silence hadn't warned her about, was the thing she'd seen in Adrian Voss's face in the last second before he turned away. Not hatred, not triumph, something that looked, just briefly, like relief. as if he'd been waiting a very long time for someone else who knew the shape of the wreckage from the inside. She picked up her bag and walked into the house. The east wing on the third floor smelled like old paper and central heating and something else underneath. Cedar, maybe, or the particular dry cold of rooms that had been closed for a long time before someone thought to open them for a guest. Elena stood in the middle of the bedroom and looked at it the way you'd look at a place you knew you'd have to survive in rather than enjoy. The bed was large and neatly made. The furniture was dark wood, heavy, the kind that didn't move when you bumped into it. There was a writing desk near the window that looked out over the grounds, and through the rain-blurred glass she could see the stone wall at the property's edge, the iron fence beyond it, and past that the blurred lights of Vespera going about its business without any awareness of what had just happened inside a civil ceremony room on the fourth floor of a building downtown. She set her bag on the chair by the desk. She didn't unpack. Not yet. The housekeeper, a woman named Rosamond, who had the compact efficiency of someone who had maintained the same routines for 20 years and saw no reason to alter them for a new arrival, had shown her the room without commentary, pointed out the ensuite bathroom, mentioned that towels were changed on Tuesdays and Fridays, and left. The entire exchange had taken 4 minutes. Elena appreciated it. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. The ring was still there. Of course it was. She turned it once, not quite taking it off, not quite keeping it still. 1 year. She started counting backward from that and stopped at 6 months because the arithmetic was making her feel something she didn't have the energy for. Dinner at 7 was not optional, Adrian had said. She arrived at 6:58. The dining room was the kind of space that had been designed for more people than currently lived here. Long table, 12 chairs, a sideboard along the far wall with the rigid formality of a display piece rather than something anyone used regularly. 2 place settings had been laid at one end, closer together than the room's proportions called for, which she suspected was the housekeeper's practical decision rather than any gesture from Adrian. He was already there, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, standing at the sideboard pouring water. He didn't look up when she came in. "Sit wherever," he said. She sat in the chair on the left. He took the one at the head. Between them, 1.5 feet of white tablecloth, and whatever they were going to do about the fact that they'd just legally bound themselves to each other for 365 days. A woman Elena hadn't met brought in plates. Simple food, not showy, a kind of roasted chicken with vegetables that looked like it had been prepared without any attempt to impress. Elena found that unexpectedly reassuring. They ate in silence for a while. She was the one who broke it, which she'd told herself she wouldn't do, but the silence had a particular quality to it. Not comfortable, not hostile, but pressurized, as if something were accumulating inside it that would eventually need somewhere to go. "The library," she said. He chewed, swallowed, and reached for his glass before answering. "Tomorrow." She looked at him. "I'll have Rosamond show you in the morning," he said. "The secure section requires my access code. I'll give it to you." She hadn't expected that either. 2 concessions in 24 hours from a man she'd been told never conceded anything. It made her more careful, not less. "Thank you," she said, because not saying it would have been its own kind of signal. He didn't respond. He cut something on his plate with the deliberate precision of someone who was thinking about other things. "Marcus Vale called while you were getting settled," he said after a moment. She didn't know the name. She kept her face neutral. "And?" He wanted to confirm our arrangement had been formalized. His eyes came up to hers for the first time since she'd sat down. "He's my second in command. He'll want to meet you." "When?" "He'll be here Thursday." A pause. He was the one who suggested this approach. The marriage arrangement. That landed differently than she expected. She set her fork down just for a second, then picked it up again. "He suggested it. He identified you as relevant to the question of the original joint venture." Adrian's voice was flat, giving her nothing. He believed a closer arrangement would provide access to information that other methods hadn't. Elena processed that carefully, the way you'd handle something that might be sharper than it looked. "So this was his idea," she said. "The strategy was his. The decision was mine." "That's an interesting distinction." "Most important distinctions are." She looked at him, at the line of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the controlled stillness of him that she was beginning to understand wasn't composure so much as suppression. something constantly held in check. She wondered what it cost him. "Did he tell you what he expected you to find?" she asked. "He told me what he thought you knew." "And what is that?" Adrian put his fork down. He looked at her with those flat Winter River eyes and said, "That your father kept a second record of everything. Names, transfers, the real paper trail beneath the official one. And that before he died, he told you where it was." The dining room was very quiet. Outside, the rain had gentled to something that barely registered. Just a faint percussion against the windows, barely there. "My father told me he'd secured copies," Elena said slowly, each word chosen with the same care she'd used on the contract amendments. "He didn't tell me where. He didn't tell me what was in them. He told me that if something happened to him, I should find them before anyone else did." She paused. "That's everything I have." Adrian watched her face for a long moment. Reading it, she knew, looking for the seam where story met lie. "Marcus believes you know more than that," he said. "Marcus doesn't know me." "No." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not warmth, not quite, but the faint acknowledgement of a point scored. "He doesn't." She found the inconsistency on her fourth day in the house. The library's secure section was smaller than she'd expected. A room within a room, accessed through a panel that looked like built-in shelving until you knew where to press. Inside, 4 metal filing cabinets, a work table, 2 chairs, and a single overhead light that hummed faintly when it was on. Adrian had given her the access code without ceremony, just a slip of paper left on her desk that morning with 5 digits written in his handwriting. Tight, angular, nothing wasted. She went through the cabinet systematically, the way her father had taught her, which was the way his own lawyer had taught him, chronologically first, then by party, then by subject. The Caldwell-Voss joint venture documents took up most of the second cabinet. She'd requested the same materials from the archive, or tried to, before someone pulled them. Comparing the 2 sets, what she'd seen in the archive before the files disappeared, photographed on her phone in 2 hurried sessions, she found it on the 3rd afternoon. A transfer authorization. February 14th, 2019. $52 million moved from a joint venture holding account to a third-party intermediary listed only as Greenvale Consulting. The authorization bore 2 signatures, her father's and Roland Voss's. But the date was wrong. Roland Voss had been admitted to Vespera General Hospital on February 12th with what his obituary had later called a cardiac episode. He hadn't been discharged until February 19th. He couldn't have signed this document on February 14th, which meant either the date had been falsified or someone else had signed his name. Elena sat in the small humming light of the secure room and looked at the document for a long time. Her chest felt strange, too full and too empty at the same time, the way it did when you discovered something that answered one question by blowing the roof off 4 others. She took a photograph. She put the document back exactly as she'd found it. She pressed the panel closed and went back through the library and up the stairs to her room and sat at the desk and looked out the window at the stone wall and the iron fence and the city beyond it. Someone had forged Roland Voss's signature. Her father's signature was genuine. She knew her father's hand, but Roland's name on that page was a copy, not the real thing. The pressure was wrong. The slight leftward lean that Roland Voss had apparently had, visible in his other signed documents, was absent, which meant the $52 million moved from that account under a signature that wasn't real. And whoever had authorized that transfer had either framed her father or used him, or both. She didn't go to Adrian with it immediately. She should have. She knew she should have. But she had no way yet of knowing what he knew versus what he'd been told versus what he believed, and those were 3 different territories. Instead, she went to dinner on Thursday with the information sitting in her chest like a stone in a pocket. Marcus Vale arrived at 6. She heard his car before she saw him, a particular engine sound that announced money without apology. She was in the sitting room off the main hall when he came through the door, and she had about 30 seconds to form an impression before introductions were made. He was older than Adrian by perhaps 8 years, with the kind of broad-shouldered physical authority that suggests a past in which force was used as readily as speech. His hair was silver at the temples, dark everywhere else, and he wore it with awareness of the effect. His face was open in the way that certain practiced men's faces are open, accessible, readable, the expression of someone who has spent years making other people feel they could see inside him because it was easier than them trying. He smiled when he saw her, wide, genuine looking. Elena. He took her hand in both of his and held it rather than shaking it, a familiarity she hadn't offered. I've been looking forward to this. She smiled back, the old smile, the one she'd thought she'd lost. It came back when she needed it. Mr. Vale, she said, Adrian's told me you were instrumental in bringing us together. Someone had to be practical. His eyes moved over her face with that searching quality she was beginning to recognize in the men inside Adrian's world, the constant low-level assessment, reading for threat or use. Adrian tends to prefer the direct approach. Sometimes a longer game is more productive. She kept the smile in place. I find most worthwhile things take time. Something moved behind his eyes. Appreciation, she thought, or calculation dressed as appreciation, which wasn't quite the same. I think, Marcus said, releasing her hand, you and I are going to understand each other very well. She thought, I doubt it. She said, I hope so. Dinner with Marcus at the table was a different architecture than dinner with Adrian alone. Marcus talked, not compulsively. He was too controlled for that, but steadily, filling the room with the warm noise of a man who was comfortable with attention. He told a story about a property negotiation in the city's eastern district that had taken 2 years to resolve, told it with humor and self-deprecation, made Adrian the hero of it twice. Elena watched Adrian while Marcus talked. Adrian was not relaxed. It was subtle. In the way that bruises under the skin are subtle, you have to know to look for the pressure points. He ate, he responded when addressed, he didn't perform tension, but his shoulders held a particular quality and his jaw worked between bites in a way she'd already identified as involuntary, and twice he glanced at her with a look that she couldn't entirely decode, but that had something watchful in it. He was monitoring her and Marcus. Together. In the same room. She filled that away and kept her face pleasantly neutral throughout the soup course. You've been looking through the library materials, Marcus said to her, somewhere between the main course and whatever came after. She looked up from her plate. Adrian gave me access. Of course. That was the point. He lifted his wine glass. Find anything useful? The room held its breath, or maybe that was just her. The organization of the files was interesting, she said. It'll take more time to go through everything systematically. Of course. His smile didn't change, which meant something. Under the table, her hand was flat on her knee, pressing down. The 2019 transfer documents are a bit scattered, she continued. Some dating inconsistencies. Adrian's fork stilled. Marcus set down his wine glass. That's common in joint venture documentation. Multiple parties, multiple sets of records. Things get filed out of sequence. She picked up her own glass. I'm sure that's it. The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds, which was 1 second longer than normal silence at a dinner table. Then Marcus redirected to a story about something else, and the conversation moved on, and Elena drank her wine and looked at nothing in particular. Beside her, she felt Adrian looking at her profile. She didn't look back. After dinner, Marcus and Adrian disappeared into what she'd come to think of as the workroom, a study off the main hall that she hadn't been given access to, didn't ask for, filed under later. She went upstairs. She was at the writing desk, the photograph of the transfer document pulled up on her phone, when she heard the knock. Adrian. She knew his knock already, which surprised her. 4 days, and she already had the rhythm of it. Come in. He opened the door but didn't come all the way through. He stood in the frame with his jacket still on from dinner, tie loosened, looking at her with that flat assessment that she was beginning to find less threatening and more something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. The dating inconsistencies, he said. I didn't want to discuss it at the table. I know, that was correct. He looked at her steadily. What did you find? She turned the phone and held it up so he could see the photograph. He crossed the room, took the phone from her, looked at it. She watched his face while he read. The muscle in his jaw, the slight tension around his eyes that was different from his usual controlled blankness, more interior, more personal. February 14th, he said. Your father was in the hospital. I know when he was in the hospital. Then you know this isn't his signature. He handed the phone back. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the dark and the wall and the lights of the city, and she let the silence go where it needed to go and didn't try to fill it. My father signed things in advance sometimes, he said. Pre-authorized transfers, standing orders. His voice was careful. Controlled in the way something is controlled when you're working at it. Marcus handled the implementation. The word Marcus sat in the room between them. Elena said nothing. Marcus handled most of the joint venture's operational details, Adrian continued, still to the window. My father trusted him completely. I trusted him. He stopped. She waited. He turned around. His face had changed. Not broken, nothing so visible. But the layer of careful blankness had thinned, just enough to show what was underneath. A man who had built his entire infrastructure of grief and anger on top of a foundation he was now looking at for the first time with real uncertainty. You think Marcus authorized that transfer, he said. I think someone did. And it wasn't your father, and it may not have been mine. She held his gaze. I think someone moved $52 million under your father's forged name and arranged for my father to take the blame for the resulting collapse. That's a significant accusation. It's not an accusation yet. It's a hypothesis. I need the original documents, the ones my father said he secured, the real paper trail. If they exist. They exist. He didn't make things up, whatever else he was. She looked down at the phone, at the photograph, at the wrong signature on a document that had destroyed 2 families. He was many things I didn't know, but he wasn't a liar. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. The 3rd filing cabinet, he said. 2nd drawer. There's a folder marked Greenvale. I put it there 6 months ago when I started going back through everything. I didn't know what I was looking for. Elena stared at him. I know, he said. I should have told you earlier. You should have told me before you brought me into this house. Probably. He met her eyes, and for once there was nothing calculated in it, just the direct weight of something he was admitting without dressing it up. But I didn't know if I could trust you. Do you now? He didn't answer that. He walked to the door, stopped. Greenvale, he said without turning. Pull everything with that name, all 5 years of it. A pause. Lock the library after you go in, and don't tell Marcus what you found. He left. Elena sat for a moment in the quiet of the room with her father's name and Roland Voss's forged signature and a man she'd married to destroy her standing somewhere in the hallway of his own house, reconsidering the architecture of his certainty. Then she got up, took her phone, and went to find the Greenvale folder. She found more than a folder. The 2nd drawer of the 3rd cabinet contained 3 folders. The one marked Greenvale, one marked simply RV correspondence. Roland Voss's personal letters, she realized. The kind that men like him kept in handwriting rather than email because they understood instinctively what survived subpoenas. And beneath those, at the back of the drawer, an envelope that had been taped closed and then opened and resealed badly, the adhesive uneven, one corner lifting. She looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. Inside, 8 photographs, printed, not digital, the slightly glossy quality of a pharmacy print job. They showed a man and a woman at a table in what looked like a hotel restaurant, the kind of private corner table you request when you don't want to be seen. The man's back was partly to the camera, but she could see enough of his profile. Marcus Vale. The woman across from him was harder to identify. 50s, well-dressed, dark hair cut short. She was leaning forward over the table in the posture of someone making a very serious point to someone who was listening very carefully. On the back of the first photograph, in handwriting she didn't recognize, MV plus Harriet Sorrell, Nov 11, 2018. 3 meetings, this hotel, same table. Greenvale registered to H. Sorrell, Cayman subsidiary. Elena sat down on the floor of the secure library because the chair was too far away and her legs had made a decision without consulting her. Greenvale Consulting, the third party that had received $52 million under Roland Voss's forged signature, was registered to a Cayman subsidiary controlled by a woman named Harriet Sorrell, who had met 3 times with Marcus Vale in the month before the transfer. Someone had taken these photographs. Someone had been watching Marcus. Someone had put them in an envelope and hidden them at the back of a filing cabinet in the Voss Estate's secure library, where they'd sat for... She checked the print date on the back of the last photograph. 7 years. Roland Voss. Roland had known, or suspected, or started to suspect, and been building something, and then had a cardiac episode in February 2019 at a very convenient moment while $52 million moved out of his joint venture account under his name. Elena's hands were steady. She noticed that about herself with some detachment. Her hands were absolutely steady while the rest of her felt like the floor had gone soft. She photographed everything, every document, every letter she could read quickly, every photograph. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it, resealed the envelope with the same bad adhesive, closed the drawer, closed the panel. She stood in the library's main room and breathed for 30 seconds. Marcus Vale was going to be in this house until Sunday. He was 2 floors below her right now. And if he had any idea these photographs existed, if he knew Roland had started collecting evidence, if he'd spent 7 years believing the evidence was lost in whatever chaos had followed Roland's death and the joint venture collapse, then his presence here wasn't about helping Adrian at all. He was here to find the same thing she'd just found. She walked to the library door, checked the corridor, pressed the lock, and went back to her room the long way, through the back stairs, moving quietly in the particular dark of a house that didn't belong to her and wouldn't forgive her if she made the wrong move. She had to get to Adrian before morning, but she also had to decide in the next few hours exactly how much she was going to tell him, because the Greenvale folder and the photographs answered one question cleanly and raised another that she didn't yet have an answer for. Roland Voss had started collecting evidence against Marcus before he died, which meant someone, at some point, had told Roland to start looking. The name her father had used, 3 weeks before he died, when he'd told her about the copies, "I gave them to someone I trusted," pressed at the back of her mind like a thumb against a bruise. She reached her room. She locked the door behind her. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed and her phone in her hand and the photographs filling the screen, and she thought about her father's voice in those last weeks, tired and careful and holding something back. And she thought about Roland Voss building a hidden file in his own secure library while his trusted right hand moved money under his forged name. And she thought about Adrian downstairs with Marcus Vale, trusting a man who had been engineering both their destructions for the better part of a decade. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. No area code she recognized. The message was 4 words. Stop looking. Leave tonight. She stared at it. Then she turned the phone face down on the carpet and made herself breathe through the cold that had settled in the center of her chest, because someone knew she was in this house. Someone knew what she was looking for, and either they wanted to protect her or they wanted her gone before she found the rest of it. And she had no way yet of knowing which. Show more. She didn't sleep. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed for a while, then moved to the chair, then back to the floor, and eventually ended up at the desk with the phone face up in front of her and the message still there on the screen. Stop looking. Leave tonight. 4 words that someone had sent from a number that didn't exist in any directory she could pull up. And she'd tried 3 times, fingers moving over her phone, with the mechanical efficiency of someone who needed to be doing something with their hands, while the rest of her worked on the problem underneath. Unknown, untraceable, from someone who knew she was here. She went through the short list of people who knew about the marriage. Adrian's attorney, who had processed the paperwork. Rosamond, the housekeeper, who knew by proximity. Gerald Marsh, her father's old lawyer, who'd been told what she was walking into. And Marcus Vale, who had apparently designed the entire arrangement in the first place. The list was not comforting. At 2 in the morning, she turned the phone face down again, went to the bathroom, ran cold water over her wrists because her pulse was doing something she didn't like, and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. She looked tired and sharp-eyed and like someone who had been making decisions in isolation for too long. She went to find Adrian. His room was at the end of the west corridor, which she knew because Rosamond had mentioned it in passing on her second day with the tone of someone establishing geography rather than making an invitation. She knocked twice, quietly, but not tentatively. Tentative knocks got ignored. The door opened in under a minute, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. I was still dressed, shirt untucked, shoes off, but nothing else changed from dinner. He looked at her in the doorway, read her face, and stepped back without speaking. She came in. His room was larger than hers, less aggressively neutral. Books on the nightstand, a jacket thrown over the chair rather than hung, the small signs that this was a space actually inhabited. She noted these things automatically, cataloged them, moved past. I found more than the Greenvale folder, she said. She told him everything. Straight through, without softening the order of the discoveries or the implications at the end. She showed him the photographs on her phone, she showed him the message. He looked at the photographs for a long time. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. A kind of internal collapse, controlled at the surface but visible if you knew where to look, the way a structure shows stress in the seams before it shows it anywhere else. He looked at Marcus Vale's profile in that hotel restaurant, at Harriet Sorrell leaning across the table, and something in his jaw tightened to the point that she could see it from where she was standing. "Harriet Sorrell," he said. "You know the name. She was in 3 meetings with my father in late 2017. Presented herself as a financial consultant. He used her for one project and then cut ties." He set the phone down on the nightstand. He told me later he hadn't trusted something about her, couldn't specify what. My father's instincts were usually correct. Not about Marcus. He didn't answer that. "Adrian." She waited until he looked at her. "Your father built that file. He was collecting evidence. He had photographs taken of Marcus and Sorrell meeting privately. He knew something was wrong." She paused. "And then he had a heart attack in February while $52 million moved out of the joint venture account under his forged name. His heart was bad for years." "I know. I'm not saying it wasn't real." She held his gaze. "I'm saying it was convenient." The room was very quiet. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The absence of it felt loud. "Marcus has been with my family for 14 years, Adrian said. "I know." "He was at my father's funeral. He sat in the front row. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me he was going to help me rebuild everything my father had built and protect what was left." His voice was absolutely flat, drained of affect the way voices get when emotion has been compressed past the point of expression. I believed him. "You had no reason not to." "I had every reason, I just didn't look." He picked up the phone again, looked at the photograph one more time, put it down. "He pointed me at your family. He handed me the narrative. The Caldwells as the architects of everything, your father as the man who sold mine out. He gave me somewhere to put the grief." He exhaled, not quite a breath, more like something leaving. "And I took it." She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel like stepping on something that needed to stay where it had fallen. "The message," Adrian said after a moment. "Someone's watching this house. Or watching me. Or both. Marcus has people. So do you." He looked at her sharply. "You think it came from my side?" "I think it came from someone who knew I was getting close to something. That's a small group." She hesitated. "It could be a threat. Or it could be a warning from someone who doesn't want me here when Marcus figures out I found the envelope. If he figures it out." "When?" she said. "He's been managing this for 7 years. He's careful. He'll notice the drawer was opened. The envelope was resealed badly before I got there. He's already been in that room since your father died. He put those photographs there thinking they were buried, and he's been right." She looked at him steadily. "Until now." Adrian moved to the window. The grounds outside were dark and still, the wet grass barely visible in the thin light from the property's edge fixtures. He stood with one hand on the window frame and looked out at nothing for long enough that she started counting the seconds. "He's in the East Guest Room," Adrian said. "Second floor. He leaves Sunday. It's Friday. I know what day it is. He can't know what I found. Not before we have a complete picture." She pressed forward. "There's more in those files. The Greenvale connection, the Sorrell subsidiary, that's the mechanism. But someone designed the mechanism. Someone who understood how both families operated, who had access to Roland's signature on existing documents, who knew the joint venture's financial structure well enough to move money through it without triggering immediate review." She paused. "And someone put those photographs in that envelope and hid them in your father's secure library. It wasn't Marcus. He wouldn't hide evidence against himself. Your father took those photographs. But someone helped him. Someone told him where to look." Adrian turned from the window. "Your father," he said. The word landed like a stone in still water. She felt the ripples of it move through her. "My father told me he gave copies to someone he trusted," she said, and her voice was doing something she had to consciously correct, leveling it back to neutral. "If that person was your father, if they were working together toward the end, if my father was the one who told Roland where to look, then they were both trying to expose Marcus," Adrian said. "Together. And Marcus found out." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before. Not the pressurized silence of restraint or the flat silence of exhaustion. This was the silence of two people standing in the same place with the same terrible revision of everything they thought they knew. My father didn't have a natural heart attack, Adrian said. Not a question. He said it the way you say something when the hypothesis and the evidence have finally stopped arguing with each other. Elena said nothing. She didn't need to. He crossed the room, picked up his jacket from the chair, put it on. His movements were precise and controlled, and she could see underneath them the effort that precision was costing him. The way each motion was a decision to hold the form while the interior fell apart. Get back to your room, he said. Don't go back to the library tonight. Don't speak to Marcus alone. Don't... He stopped, looked at her. Don't respond to that message. I wasn't going to. I know. I'm saying it anyway. He held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. Lock your door. Adrian. He stopped. Be careful, she said. He's been doing this for a very long time, and we are still missing pieces. He looked at her with those river water eyes, and for once she could see all the way through to whatever was at the bottom of them. Not warmth, not yet, but something that was the shape of it. The space where warmth could go once the wreckage got cleared. Go, he said. She went. Saturday moved with the particular excruciating slowness of a day on which something is about to go wrong, and you can feel the approach of it, but cannot locate the direction. Breakfast was the three of them. Marcus was in excellent spirits, easy and expansive, and filling the morning room with the noise of his good humor in a way that should have been pleasant and instead made the back of Elena's neck feel tight. He asked her about the library research with the friendly interest of a man making conversation. She gave him 3 minutes of careful vagueness about document organization, and he seemed satisfied, which told her one of two things. Either he hadn't checked the cabinet yet, or he had, and he didn't know what to look for. She ate her toast and watched him, and tried to locate the seams. Adrian was performing normalcy with a skill she hadn't known he had. He talked to Marcus about an acquisition deal in the city's southern district, asked questions, pushed back on one point, laughed once at something Marcus said. Genuine sounding, not forced. If she hadn't been there the night before, if she hadn't watched his face while he looked at those photographs, she would have read him as entirely at ease. I was extraordinary at this, she realized. The performance of surface while the interior worked on something else entirely. He'd been doing it his whole life, probably. Growing up in the house of a man like Roland Voss, learning early that what you showed and what you felt were two separate things that had to be managed independently. It wasn't so different from what she'd learned in the Caldwell house. Maybe that was why she'd been able to read him from the beginning when others apparently couldn't. After breakfast, Marcus went to make calls. Adrian passed Elena in the corridor between the morning room and the main hall and said, without stopping, without looking at her, East Library, third cabinet. Look for anything with the name Delmar Holdings. He was past her before she could respond. She waited 20 minutes, then went. Delmar Holdings was in the bottom drawer of the third cabinet, a folder thinner than the others, only 8 pages. She read them standing up, not bothering with the chair. Delmar Holdings was a shell company. Vespera registration, filed 2016. The registered agent was a law firm she recognized, mid-sized, respectable, the kind that did legitimate work and sometimes did other work alongside it without the left hand watching the right. The beneficial owner listed in the internal documentation, not the public filing, the internal record that should not have been in this cabinet at all, was a name she had to read twice. Richard Caldwell. Her father. Delmar Holdings, registered 2016, with her father listed as beneficial owner. And in the transaction records attached, 3 transfers from Delmar to Greenvale Consulting between August and November 2018. Not large, 60,000, 80,000, 45,000. Not the 52 million, but prior to it, before the main transfer. Payments to the same Cayman subsidiary that Marcus and Harriet Sorrell had been meeting to discuss. Her father had paid into Greenvale, before the collapse, before the forged signature, before everything. Elena stood in the humming light of the secure room and felt the floor shift underneath the floor she was already standing on. There were 2 ways to read this. She made herself go through both of them with the rigor of someone who had learned, slowly and at great cost, not to collapse toward the interpretation that hurt less. Option 1. Her father had been part of the original scheme. He'd funneled money to Greenvale alongside Marcus and Sorrel, then the plan had gone sideways, or he'd been cut out, and the 52 million transfer under Roland's forged name had been the moment they covered their tracks and left him exposed. Option 2. Her father had been paying for information. The 60,000, the 80,000. The amounts were wrong for a co-conspirator buying in, but right for someone paying a source. Someone inside Greenvale, or connected to Sorrel, who was feeding him documentation. Evidence. The same thing he'd been building when he told Roland Voss to start taking photographs. The amounts. She kept coming back to the amounts. A man cutting himself into a $52 million scheme did not pay in installments of 60,000. That was not how greed worked. That was how investigation worked. But she couldn't be sure. She wasn't sure. And that uncertainty was its own particular kind of suffering. She photographed everything, replaced everything, went back through the library and up the stairs. She was in the corridor outside her room when Marcus Vale came around the corner from the other direction and nearly walked into her. They both stopped. He looked at her with that open, readable face, and she looked at him, and for exactly 2 seconds, neither of them said anything. "Library run," he said. "Couldn't sleep last night," she said. "Wanted to get an early start." "Find anything useful?" "Not yet." She smiled. "It's a lot of paper." He looked at her for 1 second longer than the question warranted. Then he smiled back, warm, unbothered, absolutely nothing in his face that she could point to. "That's archive work," he said. "Take your time. We're not going anywhere." He moved past her and continued down the corridor. She didn't watch him go. She looked straight at the door of her room and kept her breathing even and waited until she heard his footsteps reach the stairs and descend before she let herself close her eyes for 3 seconds. "We're not going anywhere," the way he'd said it. She went into her room and locked the door and sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to decide whether she'd just been warned or threatened and whether there was actually a difference. She was copying the Delmar documents onto a secondary drive she'd bought 2 weeks ago at a pharmacy, the kind of preparatory habit her father had drilled into her so long ago it was now instinct, when the knock came. Not Adrian's knock. 4 sharp raps, evenly spaced, with the authority of someone accustomed to doors opening for them. She put the drive in her pocket, put her phone face down, then opened the door. Marcus. No jacket now, just shirt sleeves, hands in his pockets, expression carrying the careful comfort of someone paying a casual visit. "Do you have a minute?" he said. She stepped back. Let him in, because not letting him in told him too much. He came into the room and stood in the middle of it with the ease of a man who was comfortable in spaces that didn't belong to him, and looked around with no particular agenda apparent on his face. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "All right." Directly, without Adrian. He met her eyes. "Is that okay?" "Of course." He sat in the chair by the desk, her chair, the one she'd been sitting in for the last 4 days, thinking through the documents and the photographs and the message on her phone, and looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Less open, more specific. "How much has he told you?" Marcus said. "About why he really arranged this marriage?" She sat on the edge of the bed, mirroring his ease or trying to. "He told me what I needed to know. He told you it was about clearing the Caldwell debt, getting close to your father's information." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's the version he gave me too, when I proposed the arrangement." He paused. "It's not the whole story." She waited. "Adrian has been conducting his own investigation for the past 8 months, Marcus said. Separate from mine. Separate from the official version of why we're all here." His voice was measured, concerned sounding, the voice of someone sharing something reluctantly. "He has a theory about the original collapse that puts your family in a more, complicated position than the official account." "What theory?" "That your father and mine, and I'm paraphrasing the way Adrian has put it to me, were both victims of the same scheme. A third party. Someone who used both families as instruments." He watched her face carefully. "And that the evidence for this is buried in the Voss library." He knew about the library. Of course he did. He'd suggested the entire arrangement. "That sounds like what I've been finding," she said neutrally. "Yes." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Elena, I need you to be honest with me. What exactly have you found in that library?" Her pulse was very steady. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a car engine when you're trying to hear something else. Present, regular, not helping. Dating inconsistencies in the 2019 transfer documents, she said. Files I want to cross-reference with external records. Nothing conclusive yet. Nothing else? The files are extensive. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was still doing the open, concerned thing, but underneath it she could see the machinery now. The assessment, the calibration, the ongoing calculation of what she knew and whether it was a problem. I want you to know, he said carefully, that whatever you find, whatever the documents show, I'm on your side here. And Adrian's. I've been protecting this family for 14 years. A small pause. Sometimes protection means making difficult decisions. Decisions that look bad in isolation. She had a sudden, very clear understanding of what was happening. He was building a version. Preparing a defense in advance, in case she'd found the photographs. In case she'd found Greenvale. In case the evidence was about to surface. He was here to frame what she knew before she could give it to Adrian without his interpretation attached. Difficult decisions. The transfer. The forged signature. Her father's exposure. He was going to explain it, justify it. Tell her some version in which he'd had no choice, in which he'd been protecting the Voss empire from something worse, in which Richard Caldwell had left him no option. And he needed to tell her first before Adrian, because if he told Adrian directly, Adrian might kill him. Whereas Elena he could manage. Elena he could pressure. Elena had leverage sitting on top of her, $11 million in cleared debt, a signed contract, 12 months of her life already committed. He needed her to hear his version and stay quiet. I appreciate that, she said. He started to say something else. Her phone buzzed on the desk. They both looked at it, face down, the screen invisible. Sorry, she said. She reached over and picked it up, turning slightly so the screen angled away from him. Unknown number. Same one as last night. This time the message was longer. He's going to move against Adrian tonight. Get out of the house before 9. Take what you found with you. She put the phone face down again, kept her face entirely neutral, looked back at Marcus. My lawyer, she said. Apologies. Of course. He stood. Think about what I've said. And Elena, what you find in that library is sensitive material. It belongs to the family. To Adrian. His voice was careful. It would be a shame if it found its way somewhere before we'd had a chance to properly contextualize it. He left. She counted to 30 after the door closed. Then she stood up, walked to the window, looked down at the grounds, and thought, tonight. It was 4:17 in the afternoon. She had less than 5 hours. She went to find Adrian. He was in the workroom, the one she didn't have access to. She knocked once. When he opened the door, she didn't wait for him to speak. We have a problem, she said, and I need you to listen to everything before you say anything. He looked at her face and stepped back from the door. She came in and told him about Marcus's visit and the message and Delmar Holdings, the payments from her father to Greenvale, the 2 possible readings of those payments, and why she couldn't be certain which was right. She told him about Harriet Sorrell, about the timing of the transfers, about the specific amounts that didn't fit a co-conspirator's buy-in, but did fit an informant's fee. She told him everything, including the parts that made her father look guilty. She had decided, somewhere between the secure library and this room, that she was done managing information, done making choices about what to show and what to withhold based on how she thought it would land. That was how this whole thing had been kept going for 7 years. Everyone in the story holding back the parts that made them look worst. And the gap between what people knew and what they showed each other was exactly the space where Marcus Vale had operated. When she finished, Adrian was standing with his back against the work desk and both hands pressed flat to the surface, looking at the floor. He told you he'd made difficult decisions, he said. He was preparing the context. So when you found out what he did, you'd have his explanation already in your head. He knows you found the photographs. I think he's guessed. I don't think he knows what else was in the cabinet. She looked at him directly. Adrian, the message says he moves tonight. We have hours. The message could be from him. I know, it could be a manipulation, get us to panic, make a move, give him grounds to respond. She'd been through this. She'd turned it every direction she could. But if it's not, he's going to try to take control of the organization tonight, probably through the 2 senior people who report directly to me, Carver and Holm. He's been building relationships with both of them for years. If he moves quickly enough, gets their commitment before I can counter, the organization fractures and I'm... He stopped. Exposed, she said. Vulnerable. The word came out flat, the clinical word rather than the emotional one, and she understood that distinction completely. She reached into her pocket and put the secondary drive on the desk between them. Everything that was in those cabinets, she said, photographed. The Greenvale documents, the Sorrel photographs, the Delmar Holdings records. It's not a complete picture, but it's the beginning of one. She held his gaze. Whatever your father started building, I think my father helped him. I think the payments in the Delmar records were your father's informant inside Greenvale, and I think Marcus found out, and I think that is why my family was destroyed alongside yours. Her voice held. She was proud of that. I can't prove it yet, but I believe it. Adrian looked at the drive. He looked at her. Outside, somewhere on the floor below them, a door opened and closed. Marcus moving through the house with his familiar ease, his 14 years of familiarity, his knowledge of every room and access point and schedule. I have to make 2 calls, Adrian said. His voice had changed, not hard, not cold, but stripped down to something underneath all of it, something that had been compressed for a very long time. And then we need to get you out of this house. I'm not leaving without you. Elena, if Marcus is going to move tonight, you can't be alone in this building. She held his gaze. And I'm not leaving with half the evidence. We finish this together or we don't finish it. He looked at her for a long moment with something she couldn't name working through his expression. You understand what you're agreeing to, he said. Yes. He's not... He stopped, chose a different path through whatever he was trying to say. Marcus Vale has killed people, not directly. He arranges things, but the arrangement is the same as the act. I know. She did know. She'd understood it somewhere around the second cabinet drawer the previous night, looking at the forged signature and the Cayman subsidiary, understanding the structure of what had been built. Adrian, make the calls. We don't have time for this part. He looked at her once more, with those eyes that she'd spent 2 weeks reading and still couldn't fully map, and then he picked up his phone. She moved to the window and stood there watching the grounds go gray in the early evening light and thought about her father's voice. I gave them to someone I trusted. And she thought about Roland Voss building his hidden file while the man he trusted most moved money under his name. And she thought about 7 years of 2 families believing they were each other's destruction while the actual architect walked freely between them. She thought about the ring on her finger, the plain platinum thing that was supposed to be a punishment and had become something she couldn't yet name. She heard Adrian's voice behind her, low and controlled, making the first call. And she thought, if Marcus moves tonight, if he has already had those conversations with Carver and Holm, if the organization is already tilting away from Adrian by the time the sun goes down, then everything they'd found, everything in the drive in her pocket, every photograph and forged signature and payment record, became not just evidence, but the only thing standing between Adrian Voss and the complete destruction of the life Marcus Vale had been systematically dismantling for the better part of a decade. She would not let that happen. She turned from the window and looked at the man behind the desk. This man she'd agreed to marry as an act of mutual suspicion. This man she'd been trying to read for 2 weeks from the outside and had somehow ended up inside the same problem with, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not peace and not comfort, but was something equally solid, resolve. The kind that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't wait to feel ready. Behind her, through the window, the lights of Vespera began coming on one by one in the early dark, the city continuing its business with its usual indifference. And somewhere in this house, Marcus Vale was making his own preparations, and the clock was moving whether they were ready or not. The first call took 4 minutes. Elena stood at the window and listened to Adrian's side of it without trying to, the low, controlled cadence of a man delivering information to someone who needed to receive it without reaction, the brief pauses where the other end spoke. The single hard silence near the end that told her whatever he'd heard had confirmed something he'd been hoping wouldn't be confirmed. He hung up and made the second call immediately, no pause between them. And this one lasted 90 seconds and consisted almost entirely of 3 words repeated in different configurations. Not yet. Wait. Then he put the phone down on the desk and stood there with both hands pressed flat to the surface and his head dropped forward for exactly 3 seconds. It was the most unguarded she'd ever seen him. She didn't look away. He straightened. Carver met with Marcus this afternoon, he said, while we were at breakfast. Private meeting, 40 minutes, in the garden. His voice was clean and flat. Carver called me 10 minutes ago to tell me about it. He declined whatever Marcus offered him. And Holm? Holm didn't call me. The room absorbed that. How many people does Marcus have? She said. Inside the organization? I don't know anymore. He picked up the drive she'd left on the desk, turned it once in his hand. Outside it, Sorrell's network, whoever he's been building for 7 years while I was watching the wrong direction, that I genuinely cannot quantify. Who do you trust completely? Carver, 2 others, Desh and Priya. They work logistics, been with my family since my father's time. He paused. That's it. That's the honest list. 3 people. Against Marcus Vale and 14 years of patient construction and a network she couldn't map. Call them, she said. Now, get them to this house. If Marcus sees them arrive, if Marcus is moving tonight, he already knows what he's doing. We don't have the luxury of subtlety anymore. She held his gaze. Call them. He called them. What? Desh arrived first, 40 minutes later, coming in through a service entrance at the back of the property that Elena hadn't known existed. He was compact and quiet-moving, somewhere in his late 40s, with the specific economy of motion that suggested he'd spent years in spaces where being noticed was expensive. He looked at Elena once, assessed something, and didn't look at her like she was a problem. She appreciated that. Priya came 12 minutes after, through the same entrance. Younger, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back with functional rather than aesthetic intent. A tablet under one arm that she was already working on before she'd fully crossed the threshold. Carver came last, at 6:45, and he was the one who changed the architecture of the room when he entered. Tall, broad, with the kind of physical presence that didn't announce itself but simply altered the available space. He looked at Adrian and said, "You knew it was him." I suspected. For how long? Weeks. Adrian met his eyes. I needed more before I could move. Carver's jaw worked. He looked like a man deciding whether to be angry about this and landing, reluctantly, on professional. All right, he said. What do we have? They laid it out on the work desk, the photographs on Elena's phone, the drive's contents pulled up on Priya's tablet, the Greenvale Sorrel connection and the Delmar Holdings records, and the forged signature and the 7-year timeline. Carver stood over it all with his arms crossed and said nothing for a long time. Desh moved through the documents with the methodical attention of someone who was building a structure in his head while he read. Priya was already cross-referencing the Sorrel name against financial databases she had pulled up on a second window. Harriet Sorrel died in 2022, Priya said. Everyone looked at her. Car accident outside the city, ruled accidental. She scrolled. But Greenvale Consulting remained active. New beneficial owner registered in 2022, same Cayman subsidiary. The ownership didn't disappear. It transferred. She looked up. To a numbered company I'm going to need more time to unravel. How much time? Less than you'd want, more than we have. She was already typing. Give me an hour. Adrian looked at the clock on the wall. 6:47. Get out of the house before 9. Where's Marcus now? Carver said. East guest room, last I saw, Elena said. That was an hour ago. Carver looked at Adrian. Something passed between them. The specific communication of people who have worked together long enough to speak without speaking. I'll put eyes on him, Carver said. Don't spook him, Adrian said. Not yet. I need to know who he's contacting. Carver left. Desh positioned himself near the workroom door without being asked, which told Elena he'd done this before. The particular alertness of a man who understood that rooms needed watching. Adrian looked at her. You should be somewhere else in the house. No. Elena. If Marcus comes to me again, I need to be able to respond without you having to wonder what I told him. She held his gaze steady. I'm more useful here. Something moved through his expression. Not agreement, exactly, but the recognition that the argument was going to cost more time than accepting the outcome. Stay back from the door, he said. She stayed. At 7:23, Priya found the second layer. The numbered company that inherited Greenvale after Sorrel died, she said, and her voice had the controlled quality of someone delivering information they'd rather not be delivering. It took me a while because the structure is layered through 3 jurisdictions, but the registered agent is the same law firm as Delmar Holdings. She paused. The Caldwell Shell Company. The room was very quiet. That's not possible, Elena said. Not defensively. She meant it mechanically, structurally. My father is dead. The company should have dissolved. It should have. Priya turned the tablet to show her. But Delmar Holdings is still active. Renewed annually. The last renewal was 4 months ago. She looked at Elena carefully. By someone with power of attorney over the estate. My father didn't grant power of attorney to anyone. He died without... She stopped. Gerald Marsh. Her father's lawyer. The man who had managed what remained of the Caldwell estate in the 3 years since her father's death. The man she had called when Adrian's proposal came through, who had gone very quiet and said your father made decisions under pressure and refused to give her a straight answer. The man who, she now realized, had known she was going to Vespera Records archive because she'd told him and had gone quiet about that too. I need to make a call, she said. Her voice was steady. She was distantly amazed by that. She stepped away from the desk, moved to the far corner of the room, and called Gerald's number. It rang 4 times. Elena? His voice, when he answered, had that flatness again. The frightened professional flatness. Except this time she could hear something underneath it that she hadn't been listening for before. Guilt. Specific, located guilt. The kind that knows it's about to be named. Delmar Holdings, she said. The silence lasted 2 full seconds. Elena? Delmar is still active. You renewed it 4 months ago. You've been managing a shell company connected to Greenvale Consulting and Harriet Sorrell's network since my father died. She kept her voice very level. Tell me why. It's not what it... Gerald. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Tell me why. Another silence. She heard him exhale. The long, complicated exhale of a man who has been holding something for too long and has just been given a reason to put it down. Marcus Vale approached me 8 months after your father died, Gerald said. He told me he had evidence that would posthumously implicate your father in the original fraud. Criminal exposure, estate liability, your name attached to it. His voice was thin. He said he would bury it if I maintained the Delmar structure, kept it active, available for his use. He said he'd only need it for another year. You believed him. I was afraid. You were protecting yourself. He didn't argue with that. Gerald, she made herself breathe evenly. Is the evidence real? The evidence against my father? I don't know. His voice broke on the last word, just barely. I never saw it. He described it. I didn't... A pause. I was afraid, Elena. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. She hung up. She stood in the corner for 3 seconds with the phone pressed against her sternum. Not a comforting gesture. Just pressure, just something solid to push against while the new shape of everything rearranged itself in her chest. Marcus had been using Delmar Holdings as a live tool, a mechanism he controlled through Gerald's fear, which meant he had another lever on Elena that she hadn't known about, evidence, real or fabricated, that he could produce against her father's memory at any moment. If she moved against him, if Adrian moved against him, that evidence became the counter. She walked back to the desk. She told them what Gerald had said. All of it. Adrian's face did nothing visible, but she watched his hands on the desk surface and saw them press flat, the knuckles going briefly white, and then deliberately release. He has a dead man's switch, Desh said. It wasn't a question. Possibly, Adrian looked at Elena. Or he told your lawyer he had one and never built it. Marcus he prefers threats that don't have to be executed. The execution is messy. We can't assume he's bluffing, she said. No. Then we need his actual files. Whatever he has, wherever he's keeping it, we need to know if it's real before we make a move against him. She looked around the room, Priya at her tablet, Desh at the door, Adrian behind the desk with the drive in his hand, and 7 years of manipulation sitting on the table between them. Where does he keep things? He has a house in the Northern District, Adrian said. A server set up there. I've been in it once, 2 years ago. He keeps financial records, correspondence, operational documentation. He paused. He's meticulous. He'd have the evidence there if it exists. Can Priya get into it remotely? Priya looked up. I need the network credentials or a physical device on site. He'll have his laptop with him, Desh said from the door. Everyone looked at him. He travels with it, always. I've driven him 6 times over the years, and he carries the same bag every time. Laptop, external drive, phone. He doesn't trust cloud storage. Desh's voice was matter-of-fact. He'll have it in the guest room. The room held its breath for a moment. We're not breaking into his room, Adrian said. No, Elena said. We're distracting him while someone else does. Adrian looked at her. He wants to talk to me, she said. He told me this afternoon he wanted to speak without you present. Give him that. I'll take him to the sitting room off the main hall, far end of the house from the east guest room. She held Adrian's gaze. 20 minutes. Elena, 20 minutes. That's all Priya needs to copy what's on the external drive, right? Priya was already doing math in her head. If it's not encrypted, if it is, longer. Then we work with what we can get. She looked at Adrian. He is going to move tonight regardless of what we do. We can wait in this room for it to happen to us, or we can move first. She paused. This is the move. Adrian was quiet for 5 full seconds. Carver goes with Desh, he said. I stay on the monitor feed. There are cameras in the corridor outside the guest rooms. I have the feed on my phone. If Marcus moves before you've got him out of the room, you call me immediately. You don't pick up a call naturally in the middle of a conversation. I'll set a notification that vibrates twice. If it goes off, I'll say my lawyer is calling. She looked at him. Adrian, we have less than 2 hours. He looked at her for a moment with those winter river eyes, and she had the brief, vivid sensation of being weighed, not found wanting, not approved, just genuinely weighed, with the full attention of a man who did not do things halfway. 15 minutes, he said. Not 20, Tartya. She knocked on Marcus's door at 8:04. He opened it in under 30 seconds, which told her he'd been awake and alert rather than relaxed. He was still dressed, jacket back on now, which told her more. Elena. The warm, open expression, the readable face. I was about to come find you. I was hoping we could talk, she said. What you said this afternoon. I've been thinking about it. Something moved in his eyes, satisfaction, quickly controlled. He thought she'd come to negotiate, to take his offer of a protective narrative in exchange for her silence. Of course, he said. Give me 1 moment. He stepped back into the room. She heard the brief sounds of him doing something, a drawer maybe, or a bag. And then he was back, jacket straightened, phone in his pocket, the external drive, she noted, not in his hand, which meant it was still in the room. She led him downstairs. In the east corridor, Desh and Carver moved. In the sitting room off the main hall, Elena sat across from Marcus Vale with her hands folded in her lap and her pulse doing something she had to consciously talk down, and she listened to him begin to construct the version of the past 7 years in which he was a man who had made difficult choices for defensible reasons, and she nodded in the right places, and she asked the questions that kept him talking, and she watched the clock on the mantelpiece and counted the minutes. I was good at this. She had known he would be, but experiencing it directly was something else. The way he wove accountability into the narrative without ever actually accepting it. The way he named her father's involvement in tones of reluctant sadness rather than accusation. The way he positioned himself as the man who had kept the worst from happening when in fact he was the architect of all of it. Your father wasn't innocent, Marcus said gently at the 8-minute mark. But he wasn't the only one with blood on his hands. The joint venture was already compromised before either of us fully understood the exposure. Harriet Sorrell introduced risk that none of us had anticipated. He paused. I made decisions to protect the Voss family, Adrian's father, Adrian himself. Some of those decisions meant other people bore costs they shouldn't have borne. My father, she thought. Your decisions meant my father bore costs. I understand, she said. He looked at her with something that might have been, in another man, genuine remorse. I want to help you, he said. Whatever you found in the library, I can help you contextualize it. Present it to Adrian in a way that protects your family's reputation rather than destroying it. A careful pause. There are documents that, taken out of context, could look very bad for Richard Caldwell. I'd like to make sure that doesn't happen. There it was. The threat dressed as an offer. Give me what you found and I'll protect you from what I'll do if you don't. That's very kind, she said. Her phone vibrated. Once, twice. She looked down at it with an expression of mild apology. I'm sorry. My lawyer's been trying to reach me all day. She stood. Will you excuse me for just a moment? He stood as she did, smooth, automatic. Of course. She stepped into the hallway just outside the sitting room door, bringing the phone to her ear, and Adrian's text was on the screen. Done. Come back. 15 seconds of fake phone conversation. She turned back into the room. I'm sorry, she said again. Where were we? Marcus was standing exactly where she'd left him. His phone was in his hand. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, and it took her a full second to identify it because it was so thoroughly different from everything he'd shown her over the past 2 days. No warmth, no openness, no careful engineering of whatever she was supposed to feel. Just the flat, specific attention of a man who knew. Your room, he said. Who's in my room? Her chest dropped. I don't know what you mean, she said. He took 3 steps toward her, and the transformation was so complete and so rapid that it rearranged everything she'd built about him. The affable exterior peeling back to show something underneath that had been there all along, something cold and structural, like finding rebar in what you'd thought was plaster. Don't, he said. His voice had gone very quiet. That particular quietness that is louder than shouting. Don't do that. She held her ground, barely. Marcus, who is in my room, not loud, not soft, somewhere in between where there was no room for anything except the truth. She looked at him and made a decision in approximately 1 second. Not the lie, not the performance, not the management of how this landed. People who needed to see what you've been keeping, she said. He was still for one moment, just one. And in that moment she saw something pass through his face that she hadn't expected. Not rage, not calculation, but something older and more tired, the expression of a man who had built something for 20 years and was watching it finally reach the moment he'd always known was coming. Then he moved. He wasn't heading for her. He was heading for the hallway, for the stairs, for the east guest room. And she was in the way, and she didn't move in time, and his shoulder hit hers as he went past, and she went hard into the doorframe, the wood catching her above the elbow, a burst of bright pain that made her vision white at the edges for a half second. She got her footing back and went after him. Adrian! Her voice loud now, the performance finished, nothing left to manage. Adrian, he's moving! She hit the stairs 3 steps behind Marcus. He was fast for a man his size, not running exactly, but moving with the purposeful speed of someone who had planned exit routes the way other people plan vacations, automatically, in advance, as a matter of course. He was at the top of the stairs before she was halfway up and turning down the east corridor. She heard Carver's voice from somewhere ahead. Short, sharp, a word she didn't catch. She heard something hit a wall. She reached the top of the stairs and turned into the east corridor and stopped. Carver was on the floor. Not badly. He was already getting up, one hand on the wall, but Marcus had hit him with something, or threw something, and the corridor had the disarranged quality of a space where physics had been briefly argued. Desh was coming from the guest room doorway, moving fast, and Marcus was between them and the staircase to the upper floor, and he had something in his hand, not a gun, a phone. He was dialing. Stop, Adrian said. He was at the end of the corridor, having come from the upper stairs, and he had the drive in his hand, the external drive from Marcus's bag, and he held it up so Marcus could see it. Marcus stopped dialing. The corridor went absolutely still. 4 people and the history of 7 years and whatever Marcus was about to call into being if he finished that number. You don't know what's on that, Marcus said. I know enough. Adrian's voice was the flattest she'd ever heard it, stripped to the foundation. Nothing performative in it, nothing managed, just the voice of a man who had arrived at a place he couldn't unarrive at. I know about Greenvale and Harriet Sorrell. I know about the February transfer and my father's signature. A pause. I know about Delmar Holdings. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Elena. She was standing at the corridor's midpoint between them, her arm throbbing where the door frame had caught her, her breathing audible in the silence. She looked back at him and didn't adjust her face into anything. You think you have the complete picture, Marcus said to Adrian. Still quiet. Still that unnerving calm. Complete enough. You don't. He looked back at Adrian and something in his expression shifted. Not fear, she realized, not quite, but the specific resolve of a man choosing to play the card he'd been holding. There are things about your father, Adrian, about the joint venture, about what he agreed to before I was ever involved. His voice was very steady. Things I have documented. Things that will change what you think you know about where this started. Adrian said nothing. Your father wasn't the victim you've been grieving, Marcus said. He was a participant, early, willingly, until he decided he wanted out and thought he could build a case against me to buy his freedom. His eyes were on Adrian's face, watching it for the thing he needed, the doubt, the fracture, the place where certainty cracked. I protected this family for 14 years because the alternative was exposing what Roland Voss actually did. Every year I kept quiet was a year I chose your family's reputation over the truth. The corridor was so still that Elena could hear the heating system in the walls. She watched Adrian's face. She had seen him manage his expression through 2 weeks of meals and confrontations and the dismantling of everything he thought he knew. She had seen the compression of grief into blankness, the management of rage into controlled speech. She had never seen him fail at it. He didn't fail at it now. But something changed, some quality of the stillness, some adjustment in how he held himself. And she understood that Marcus's words had landed somewhere real. Marcus saw it too. Put the drive down, Marcus said, and let's talk. The way we should have talked years ago without... He glanced briefly at Elena. Complications. No, Elena said. Both men looked at her. He's doing it again, she said to Adrian directly. Not loudly, with the simplicity of someone stating something that doesn't need ornamentation. He's building a version. He's been building versions for 7 years. And every time someone gets close to the truth, he builds a new one that reframes the evidence, repositions himself, gives you somewhere else to point the grief. She held Adrian's gaze. Whatever your father did or didn't do, Marcus Vail forged his name on a $52 million transfer and let 2 families destroy each other over it for 7 years. The rest is... She stopped. Don't let him make the rest of it the story. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Marcus moved, not for the stairs, for Elena. It wasn't a full attack. She understood that in the fraction of a second before it registered physically. It was a grab, a control move, the instinct of a cornered man reaching for the nearest leverage. And she was the nearest leverage, and her arm was already compromised from the doorframe, and when his hand closed on it above the elbow, the pain was a white burst that made her breath lock. She didn't scream. She had enough of her wits to deny him that. But she went off balance, into the wall, and Marcus had her arm and was putting himself between her and Adrian, and she could feel the calculation in his grip. Not cruelty, pure utility. She was a variable he was repositioning. The drive, Marcus said, to Adrian. Very quiet. Put it down. Adrian looked at her. She could see what was in his face now. It was not the compressed blankness, not the managed calm. It was something she'd never seen on him and recognized immediately anyway, the way you recognize things you haven't seen but have been expecting. The specific fury of someone who has identified the exact cost of what they're dealing with and is deciding what price they're willing to pay. Let go of her, Adrian said. The drive, Adrian. Let go of her first. That's not how this... Adrian dropped the drive. Not gently. He let it fall, the crack of it on the corridor floor loud in the silence, and he crossed the distance between them in 4 steps with a speed and directness that Marcus, for all his planning, had apparently not factored in, because the calculation in Marcus's face shifted to something else in the last half second, and he released Elena's arm and brought his hands up too late. Adrian hit him once. Clean, direct, no performance. The kind of impact that comes from controlled rage rather than wild rage, which is always worse, always more precise. Marcus went into the wall and stayed there, one hand pressed to the side of his face, breathing hard. Carver was up. Desh was there. Priya appeared from the stairwell at the corridor's end with her tablet clutched to her chest and her eyes taking in the scene with the rapid assessment of someone doing rapid triage. Marcus looked at Adrian from against the wall. His face had finally given up on the version building. What was left underneath, the actual face, the one that had been running the machine for 7 years, was older than she'd thought, and more tired, and almost, in some terrible way she hadn't anticipated, more human. You can't undo what your father did, Marcus said. His voice was rough. Even with everything on that drive. I'm not trying to undo anything, Adrian said. I'm ending it. He looked at Carver. Carver nodded and moved to Marcus, and Desh moved to the other side. And Marcus didn't resist. He was past resistance. She could see that. He'd made the calculation and found the number came up short. But he kept his eyes on Adrian's face with the expression of a man who had not said everything he intended to say. "The evidence about your father," Marcus said, as Carver's hand closed on his arm. "You think it's on that drive. It's not." He held Adrian's gaze. "You'll want to find it before someone else does." He let Carver take him. Elena stood in the corridor with her back against the wall and her arm aching in a steady, deep pulse and watched them go. Marcus and Carver and Desh moving toward the stairs, Priya already picking up the drive from the floor and checking it with the focused efficiency of someone with a job to finish. Adrian turned to her. He looked at her arm, at the way she was holding it, at the wall she was leaning against. He didn't say anything immediately. He crossed to her and put one hand against the wall beside her head, not a gesture of intimidation, just proximity, just the placement of himself between her and the rest of the corridor, and she understood it as the instinct it was. "How bad?" he said. "Not bad." It wasn't, quite. Deep bruise, possibly. Nothing structural. "I'm fine." He looked at her face for a moment with those eyes. "I wasn't going to hurt you," Adrian said. "He was going to use you. There's a difference, but it doesn't matter." "It matters a little," she said. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile but was the shape of one. "Priya," he called down the corridor. "Drive's intact," she called back. "Copying now. Give me 40 minutes. "What did Marcus mean?" Elena said quietly, so only Adrian could hear it. "About the evidence not being on the drive." His jaw tightened. "He means there's another location, another set of documentation about my father that he's been keeping somewhere we haven't found." He looked down the corridor toward the stairs. "He's been holding it as a final card. If everything else collapsed, that's the card he'd play." "Can Priya find it?" "Maybe. If it's digital." He looked back at her. "If it's physical, we have a different problem." She pushed off the wall. Her arm complained about it. She ignored the complaint. "Then we find it," she said. "Elena, he said before someone else does." She met his eyes. "He has people we don't know about. People who will move when they realize he's been contained. If those files exist and they reach someone outside this house tonight, I know. Then we have to move now, tonight, before whoever else he was calling when we caught him gets a chance to respond." She held his gaze. "What would your father have done?" Something shifted in his expression, deep, tectonic, the movement of something very large and very long settled. "My father," he said, and stopped. She waited. "My father would have burned it," he said finally. "Whatever the evidence was, he would have destroyed it rather than let it exist." A pause. "Which is why Marcus has been able to hold it over the Voss name for 7 years. "Then you're not your father," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Somewhere below them in the house, a door closed. The sounds of Carver and Desh managing Marcus moved through the building's structure, distant, muffled. The ordinary sounds of a situation being contained. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He turned it to show her the screen, the notification, waiting there, the number he'd pulled from Marcus's recent calls while Priya copied the drive. An outgoing call at 7:51. Duration, 43 seconds. Long enough to deliver a short message. The number had a name attached to it in Marcus's contacts, N. Caldwell. Elena looked at the name on the screen, N. Caldwell. There was no N. Caldwell in her family. She was the last of them, and her name was Elena, and her father had been Richard, and every other Caldwell she'd known had been a generation above her, all of them dead before she was 20. She looked up at Adrian. His face told her he'd already done the same math and come up with the same impossible answer. "That's not a family member," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." He looked at the number on the screen. The number Marcus had called for 43 seconds at 7:51, while Elena was keeping him in the sitting room and Desh and Carver were in his guest room, the call he'd managed to make in the 30 seconds he'd been alone when she'd stepped outside to check her phone. "Whoever N. Caldwell is," Adrian said, "Marcus just told them everything that happened tonight." The hallway felt very cold suddenly. Elena looked at the name on the screen and felt the understanding arrive, the way understanding arrives when you've been missing one piece and it finally appears. Not dramatic, not slow, just suddenly present, rearranging everything around it, and she pressed her back against the wall because her legs needed a moment to agree with what her mind was doing. N. Caldwell, the name her father had used 3 weeks before he died, when he told her about the copies. I gave them to someone I trusted. Pressed at the back of her mind like a thumb against a bruise. Someone I trusted, her father had said. And she had assumed, all this time, that the someone was Roland Voss. But Roland Voss was dead before her father made that call. She looked at Adrian and said, very quietly, my father had another contact, someone he trusted enough to give the copies to. Someone whose name starts with N. She held his gaze. And Marcus Vale just called them. The house settled around them in the dark and the cold, and somewhere in Vespera a phone was ringing with Marcus's message in it, and whoever answered it was about to know that the game had shifted, and they were running out of night to find out which direction the shift was going to push everything that was left. Priya found the number's registered address in 11 minutes. She did it the way she did everything, without announcing the process, without narrating the steps, just producing the result with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that what people needed was the answer, not the methodology. She came up the stairs with her tablet and said, Northern District, the Belmore Building, Unit 14, registered to a holding company out of the same law firm as Delmar. She paused. The occupant's name on the utility accounts is N. Caldwell, first name Nathan. Elena said the name once, quietly, to herself. Nathan Caldwell. She had a half memory of the name, not vivid, not clear, the kind of memory that lives in the body rather than the mind, attached to a smell or a sound rather than a face. Her father's study, years ago, a phone call she'd half heard through a closed door, her father's voice saying a name with the particular weight he used for people he'd known a long time. She'd never met a Nathan Caldwell. She hadn't known one existed. Cousin, she said. Not a question. The half memory was assembling itself. My father had a cousin who moved away. Before I was born, I think. There was some kind of falling out. She looked at Adrian. Adrian, I don't know the details. My father didn't talk about him. But he trusted him enough to give him the copies, Adrian said. He trusted him enough to call him when he knew he was running out of time. She thought about that. About her father in those last weeks, tired and careful, holding something back. What it must have cost him to reach out to someone he'd been estranged from, to ask for help from a person he'd spent years not speaking to, because everyone else he'd trusted had either betrayed him or was already dead. She thought about the phone ringing right now in Unit 14 of the Belmore building. Marcus told him everything, she said. 43 seconds is enough. Adrian was already moving toward the stairs. We need to get there before Nathan decides which direction to run. They took Carver's car because it was the one already out front. Desh stayed with Marcus. Priya stayed with the drive, still copying, still pulling threads from the files they had. Carver drove and said nothing, which was the right decision. The city moved past the windows in its late-night register. Lights thinning, streets clearing, Vespera settling into the particular quiet of a place that never goes fully silent but does, between midnight and 3, drop its voice. Elena sat in the back beside Adrian and held her injured arm against her body and thought about her father. She had spent 5 years being angry at him. Not cleanly. Grief doesn't produce clean anger. It produces the complicated kind that has guilt running through it like a seam through rock, inseparable from the material. She'd been angry at him for the debt, for the exposure, for the choices he'd apparently made that had left her standing in the rubble of the Caldwell name, trying to figure out which pieces were worth picking up. But she thought about Delmar Holdings now, about the payments that didn't fit a co-conspirator's buy-in, but did fit an informant's fee, about her father reaching out to Roland Voss, pointing him toward Marcus, helping an old man build a hidden file in his own secure library, about the copies he'd secured and given to a cousin he hadn't spoken to in years, because he'd understood that the evidence had to outlive him if the truth was going to get out at all. He'd known he was running out of road. He'd done what he could with what he had left. She wasn't sure yet if that was enough to rearrange 5 years of complicated anger into something cleaner, but it was enough to make her want to finish what he'd started. The Belmore building was a mid-rise in the Northern District's quieter section, the kind of building that had been expensive once and had since settled into respectable without being notable. Unit 14 was on the 4th floor. The lobby had a security panel that Carver bypassed with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who considered security panels more of a suggestion than an obstacle. They took the stairs. 4th floor. The corridor was carpeted in something dark and functional, the overhead lights in that particular low-sodium yellow of buildings that had been built for utility. Unit 14 was at the far end. Adrian knocked. The pause that followed was long enough to tell them someone was on the other side, deciding something. Then the door opened. Nathan Caldwell was in his mid-60s, which she hadn't expected. She'd done no math on when the falling out had happened, hadn't thought through the generation gap. He was lean in the way of men who had never been large and had gotten leaner with age, with silver hair worn slightly too long, and her father's eyes, which was something she wasn't prepared for and had to absorb quickly and quietly, the specific dark brown that she'd grown up reading for mood and approval, and the particular quality of his attention. He looked at her and went still in the doorway. "You look like him," he said. Not to her, to the air beside her, to the space where her father's absence lived. "I know," she said. He stepped back. Let them in. The apartment was the space of a man who lived carefully and alone, not sparse, but deliberate, everything with a place and nothing excessive. Books, organized. A desk near the window with papers that he'd clearly just been going through, disturbed by the evening's events or the anticipation of this visit, or both. On the desk, a folder. Elena saw it before she saw anything else in the room. Nathan saw her see it. "I've been waiting for someone to come," he said. "I wasn't certain who it would be." He looked at Adrian. "You're the Voss son." "Adrian." Nathan nodded slowly. He moved to the desk, put his hand on the folder, but didn't pick it up. "Marcus called 20 minutes ago. Told me you'd contained him. Told me—" He stopped. Something moved through his face. "He told me to run. Take the folder and disappear." He looked down at his hand on the cover. "He said it was the only thing keeping either of us safe." "Is that what you're going to do?" Elena asked. He looked at her for a long moment with her father's eyes. "Your father called me 3 weeks before he died," Nathan said. "We hadn't spoken in 19 years. I picked up because I didn't recognize the number, and I almost didn't." He moved away from the desk, sat in the chair near the window, the posture of a man settling in for something he'd been composing for a while. "He told me what he'd found, what he'd given Roland Voss. He said he didn't expect to be alive when it mattered, and he needed someone outside the circle to hold the evidence. He trusted you," she said. "He trusted that I hated Marcus Vale more than I hated him." Nathan looked at his hands. "Marcus ran a deal through my company in 2015. A legitimate business, freight logistics, nothing connected to the Voss organization. He used my company as a routing mechanism for 3 transactions without my knowledge. When I found out and threatened to report it, A pause. He made it clear that reporting it would implicate me as a willing participant. He had documentation that looked exactly like that. He'd built it before I even knew he was using my company." He looked up. "He'd done it to me first. Before your father. Before Roland Voss." His voice was flat and tired and about 20 years old. "That's how he operates. He builds the trap before you know you're being hunted." The room was quiet. "So you took the copies my father gave you," Elena said, "and I added to them." Nathan looked at the folder on the desk. "I had my own records from 2015. The routing documentation, the false trail he built through my company. I've been adding to that file every year since your father died. Every piece of Greenvale's public financial activity, every incorporation document I could trace, every connection between Marcus and Sorrel and the Cayman structure." He paused. "It's not everything, but it's enough." Adrian moved to the desk. He looked at the folder without touching it. "Why didn't you take it to anyone? After my father died, after Elena's father, who would I take it to?" Nathan's voice was quiet and not unkind, just honest. "Marcus Vale has operated inside Vespera's financial and legal infrastructure for 2 decades. The people I would have needed to go to, investigators, prosecutors, regulatory bodies, he knows them. He's cultivated them. Some of them he owns." He looked at Adrian directly. "I needed someone with enough standing inside the system to take the evidence somewhere it couldn't be buried. I didn't have that." A pause. "You do." The word landed in the room with its full weight. Adrian looked at the folder, then at Elena, then back at Nathan. "If I take this," he said carefully, "and submit it to the right people, what happens to your 2015 exposure? The freight company. Nathan looked mildly surprised, as if he hadn't expected the question to come from that direction. "That's my problem," he said. "Maybe. Or maybe it's part of the same submission." Adrian held his gaze. Everything goes in together: the 2015 routing scheme, the Greenvale structure, the forged transfer, the Sorrel connection. All of it, with context and chronology. Marcus built traps by isolating pieces from each other. We don't give the same pieces the same treatment. A pause. Your company's involvement goes in as evidence of the pattern, not as independent liability. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "You'd do that," he said. "I'm doing it." Something shifted in Nathan Caldwell's face. Not relief exactly, which would have been too simple. Something more like the exhaustion of a man who has been holding himself very still for a very long time and has just been told he can stop. He picked up the folder and held it out. Adrian took it. They were back in the car when Priya called. She spoke for 4 minutes. Elena listened to Adrian's side of it, the short affirmations, the single question, the silence at the end before he said, "Send it all to Carver's secure account," and hung up. "What did she find?" Elena said. The drive had everything. His voice was even, controlled, but she could hear the thing underneath it, the weight of information that changes the shape of everything that came before. Marcus has been documenting himself for years, not confessionally, operationally. Records of every transaction, every arrangement, every person he paid or threatened or used. He kept it because it was leverage, evidence of other people's involvement that he could deploy if he was ever exposed. Adrian looked out the window at the passing city, including records of what happened to my father. She waited. "The cardiac episode in February 2019, he said. "It wasn't arranged in the way I thought when I said it last night. Marcus didn't harm my father directly." His jaw tightened. But he knew my father's cardiologist. He'd been feeding him information, selected, curated, designed to manage my father's treatment in a direction that kept him incapacitated at the right moment, extended the episode, kept him out of commission through the transfer window. A long pause. "The cardiologist died in 2021, also in a car accident. Harriet Sorrel, 2022. Car accident. The cardiologist, 2021. Car accident." Elena said nothing. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already contain. "He didn't leave loose ends," Adrian said. "He left us," she said. He looked at her. "He left the photograph in your father's library. He left Nathan alive. He left my father's copies intact." She held his gaze. "I was careful about the people who could act against him. He wasn't careful about the ones he thought would stay buried." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "My father used to say," he said slowly, "that the most dangerous thing you can do to an enemy is underestimate them." He turned back to the window. "Marcus thought he'd underestimated me. He never considered you." Carver drove. The northern district gave way to the mid-city, the lights thickening again as they moved south and east, back toward the estate. They submitted the complete package at 9:17 the following morning. It went to 3 places simultaneously: the Vespera Financial Crimes Authority, the regional prosecutor's office, and a journalist at the city's oldest independent newspaper whom Priya had spent the night researching and whom Adrian had spent 20 minutes on the phone with at 7 in the morning, verifying her record on financial crime reporting and deciding, with the kind of deliberate certainty she was coming to recognize as his natural mode, that she was the right person. The package contained the drive's contents: Nathan's folder, Gerald Marsh's recorded admission, which Elena had quietly obtained in a second phone call at midnight, Gerald's voice going through the whole of it with the particular broken openness of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally been given permission to put it down. The photographs of Marcus and Soriel, the forged transfer document, the Greenvale Sorrel Delmar chain, the cardiologist connection, which Priya had corroborated through hospital record cross-referencing and prescription documentation that Marcus had, with characteristic thoroughness, recorded in his own files. Everything, contextualized and chronological, the way Adrian had said in Nathan's apartment, not isolated pieces but the full pattern, assembled so that no individual element could be separated from the structure that gave it meaning. Marcus Vale was taken into custody at 11:45 that morning. Elena heard about it from Carver, who called with 2 sentences and no editorializing, which was appropriate. She was in the library when she heard. The main library, not the secure room. sitting at the long reading table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, going through nothing in particular, just sitting in the space where the evidence had been for 7 years, feeling the specific quality of an aftermath. She had expected to feel more. She examined this expectation with some care, turning it over, looking for what she'd thought would be there. Triumph, maybe, or relief, or something that resolved into a clean emotional note. What she felt instead was quieter and more complicated and harder to name. Something in the register of completion, but not satisfaction. The difference between a wound closing and a wound healed, which are not the same thing. She thought about her father. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with him, 3 weeks before he died. Not the one where he'd told her about the copies, which she'd been thinking about for days, but the earlier one, the ordinary one, where they talked about nothing in particular over the phone, and she'd been impatient to get off the call because she had things to do. She'd been impatient. She remembered that specifically. She'd said, "I have to go," and she'd meant it, and she'd gone. She hadn't known it was one of the last ones. She picked up the cold tea, drank it anyway, and sat in the library until she was ready to leave it. Adrian found her there an hour later. He came in quietly, which was how he did most things, and sat in the chair across the table from her without asking if she wanted company, which was also how he did things. The particular consideration of a man who had spent enough time alone to understand that sometimes the question is worse than the assumption. They sat for a while without speaking. "Carver told you," he said. "Yes." He looked at the shelves, at the rows of files and folders and years of documentation that had been sitting in this house, waiting. "The prosecutor's office called while you were in here. They want a formal statement, both of us." He paused. "Nathan, too." He agreed to come in. She nodded. "Gerald Marsh is cooperating," he continued. He turned over everything he had on Delmar, the power of attorney documentation, the timeline of Marcus's contact with him. A pause. "He's going to face some professional consequences. I don't know how serious." "He was afraid," she said. "Yes. That doesn't excuse it, but it's true." Adrian looked at her. The morning light was coming through the library windows at a low angle, the kind of winter light that illuminates without warming, and it caught the lines of his face, the tension that lived in his jaw even when he was still, the way his eyes held their particular gray-green quality that she'd spent 2 weeks learning to read. "The Caldwell debt," he said. It was cleared 3 days ago. The paperwork went through before any of this. I had it processed when you signed the contract." He held her gaze. "That stands regardless of what happens with everything else." She looked at him. "The lawsuits were suspended. The frozen accounts are being released." He said it carefully, each piece laid out with the precision of a man who wants to be understood exactly. "The contract's terms were met on my side. Whatever you decide about the rest of the year, whether you stay or—" He stopped. "Or," she said. He didn't continue. He looked at the table. She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been doing since the wedding hall when she'd watched him walk through a crowd and understood that what she was dealing with was more complicated than she'd been prepared for. She looked at the man who had brought her into his house as a weapon against his own grief and had spent 2 weeks discovering, one document and one conversation at a time, that the grief had been aimed at the wrong target all along. Who had hit Marcus Vale in a corridor with the specific contained fury of someone who is not defending himself but defending something else. Who had said, "I'm doing it in Nathan Caldwell's apartment," with a flatness that was not indifference but its opposite, the sound of a man who has made a decision and means it all the way down. "My father gave the copies to Nathan because he didn't have anyone else," she said. He'd spent years making decisions that isolated him. Not all bad decisions. Some of them were the right call with what he had. But he ran out of people to trust. She paused. "I've been doing the same thing, different version, same pattern." Adrian looked up from the table. "I'm not leaving," she said. He was very still. "Not because of the contract. The contract is a piece of paper." She held his gaze. "I'm not leaving because I don't want to, and I think you don't want me to. And I think we've both spent enough time acting on things we've told ourselves instead of things we know." The library was quiet around them. The old smell of it, paper and cedar, and the dry cold of closed rooms had become, in 2 weeks, familiar. She hadn't noticed that until now. "You should know," he said carefully, "that I'm not—" He stopped, tried a different approach. "The past 2 weeks have not been—" I know what the past 2 weeks have been, she said. I was there. Something crossed his face. Not quite the shape of a smile, but the specific quality of a man who has been outmaneuvered in a way he doesn't entirely mind. The organization is going to take months to stabilize, he said. What Marcus did, the relationships he built, the positions he held, the trust he accumulated, taking that apart without breaking everything else is going to be complicated, she said. I know. You don't have to be part of that. I know that too. He looked at her for a long moment. She let him look. She was done managing what people saw when they looked at her, the performance of competence or strength or unaffectedness. She was tired in the specific way of someone who has been operating at full output for 2 weeks without a real anchor, and it showed in the set of her shoulders and the way her injured arm was resting on the table and probably in her face, and she didn't do anything about any of it. What she showed him was just herself. The actual version, unedited, with the complicated grief for her father and the exhaustion of the last 14 hours and the specific stubborn fact of not wanting to walk out of this house. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, not a gesture, not a performance, just his hand on hers, the warm weight of it, the plain platinum of his ring catching the low winter light, and left it there. She turned her hand over, held it. They sat like that in the library for a while, in the morning light, in the quiet of an aftermath that was not clean or simple, but was, for the first time in a very long time for both of them, honest. The weeks that followed were work. That was the most accurate word for it, not resolution in the cinematic sense, not the clean arrival at a new state, but the daily, grinding, unromantic labor of dismantling what Marcus had built and trying to construct something different from the materials that remained. Adrian spent 3 weeks in meetings with his remaining people, Carver and Desh and Priya and others who came forward in the aftermath of Marcus's arrest, people who had been watching and waiting and had not known until now which direction to move. He rebuilt the organization's internal structure with the methodical patience of someone who understood that what he was really rebuilding was trust, which is slower and harder than rebuilding a financial structure and does not respond to deadline pressure. Elena sat in some of those meetings, at Adrian's request, because she had a facility for reading the room that he'd identified early and had learned to use the way you learn to use any tool that turns out to be better than the one you started with. She gave her formal statement to the prosecutor's office on a Tuesday morning in a room that smelled like institutional coffee and had the particular fluorescent flatness of official spaces everywhere. She told the truth in chronological order and answered every question completely, and felt, when it was done, the specific tiredness of having said all the true things and knowing you can't unsay them, which is its own kind of exposure. Nathan came in the following week. She met him afterward in the lobby, which hadn't been planned. He was coming out as she was passing through on another errand, and they stood in the marble-floored entrance of the prosecutor's building and looked at each other with her father's eyes between them, and she said, "Thank you for holding on to it," and he said, "He would have done the same," and she said, "I know." And they stood there another moment and then went their separate ways, which felt right. Not every recovered relationship needs to become a close one. Some of them just need to be acknowledged, the estrangement forgiven without ceremony. Gerald Marsh received a formal censure from the legal professional body and was required to surrender his operating license for 18 months. She didn't feel satisfaction about this exactly. What she felt was something more like the appropriate weight of consequence, not vengeance, just the particular gravity that applies when actions connect to their outcomes, which doesn't happen as often as it should. The journalist's piece ran on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the submission. It was thorough, well-documented, carefully sourced, and it named names in the unambiguous way that thorough journalism does when the evidence is solid. Marcus Vail's network began to surface in the week that followed. People who had been positioned inside various institutions and organizations over the years, connections that had looked like ordinary professional relationships until you saw the structure underneath. Some of them cooperated. Some did not. All of it was slow and was going to remain slow for years. Harriet Sorrell's car accident was reopened. The cardiologist's was too. Elena didn't follow the details of this closely. She had reached the limit of what she could usefully hold. On an evening in early spring, 8 weeks after the night Marcus was arrested, Elena was at the writing desk in her room when she noticed she'd stopped thinking of it as her room and started thinking of it simply as the room. She sat with that for a moment. Then she got up and went downstairs. Adrian was in the kitchen, which was unusual. He had Rosamond for everything domestic and used that fact. But there he was, standing at the counter with his jacket off and a pot on the stove that was producing something that smelled like it might be soup, working from a recipe on his phone with the focused concentration of someone doing something they don't fully know how to do and are too stubborn to stop. She leaned in the doorway and watched him for a moment. He didn't hear her. He was stirring something with the earnest attention of a man for whom this particular task was genuinely challenging, reading the screen and then looking at the pot and then reading the screen again. She said, "You're doing it wrong." He looked up. "The heat's too high," she said, "and you put the lid on, which means it's going to boil instead of simmer, and whatever you're making is going to be—" She came off the door frame, crossed to the stove, lifted the lid. "Yeah, that's already over-reduced." He looked at the pot, then at her. "I had it under control." "You absolutely did not." He stepped back without argument and let her take the spoon, and she turned the heat down and added water from the tap and stirred, and the kitchen settled into the sounds of something being salvaged. The gentle reduction of heat, the soft movement of liquid, the particular quiet of two people standing next to each other without requiring anything of the silence. "My father used to make soup when he didn't know what else to do," she said, not particularly to Adrian, mostly to the pot. "Did it help?" "It gave him something to do with his hands." She stirred, which is most of what helping amounts to. She felt him look at her profile. "He would have liked you," she said. "My father. He had a thing for people who didn't pretend to be smoother than they were." "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "It's the best kind." The soup recovered into something workable. She found bowls in the cabinet where she'd expected them to be, which was a small thing but felt significant. The way that knowing where the bowls are in a kitchen means something about how long you've been somewhere and whether it started to mean something to you. She handed him a bowl. He took it. They stood at the counter and ate the recovered soup in the kitchen, rather than taking it to the dining room with its 12 chairs and its formal geometry. And outside the kitchen window, the early spring dark had that particular quality of a season changing. Not warm yet, but no longer committed to cold. Something in transition that hadn't finished becoming what it was going to be. "The East Wing," he said, after a while. She looked at him. "It's warmer in the West Wing. The heating system is older on your side." He didn't look at her, focused on the bowl. "There are 3 rooms on the west side that aren't being used." She looked at him for a moment. I was still looking at his soup, but the line of his jaw had the particular quality of a man who has said a thing and is waiting to find out how it lands. "I'd need the desk by the window," she said. "There's a desk by the window in all 3. And I'm not moving my books twice. Wherever I move them goes is where they stay." "That's reasonable." She looked at him a moment longer. The kitchen was warm and smelled like salvaged soup, and outside was the early dark of a spring that hadn't quite arrived yet, and she was standing in a house that hadn't been hers and was starting to be. And the man next to her had brought her here as a punishment and had turned out to be the most honest person she'd met in 5 years of everyone she knew, performing some version of something else. "Okay," she said. He nodded once, like they'd agreed on something practical, which they had and also hadn't, and went back to his soup. She went back to hers. The ring had been cold when he put it on her finger. Plain platinum, no stone, chosen for the neutrality of a symbol that was supposed to mean nothing more than the legal terms of an arrangement. She looked at it sometimes, at the desk, in the library, standing in the kitchen in the early morning waiting for the coffee to be ready, and thought about the distance between what something is made to mean and what it ends up meaning, which is never the same distance in both directions. You can make something mean less than it looks. You cannot always keep it from meaning more. She didn't take it off. She hadn't decided to keep it exactly. She just kept not taking it off, which is how most of the real decisions in a life actually happen. Not in the moment of choice, but in the accumulation of moments in which you don't choose the other thing. Adrian kept his too. She noticed that specifically one morning in the kitchen, his left hand around a coffee cup, the ring there against the ceramic, and she looked at it, and he didn't say anything, and neither did she, and the coffee was ready, and they both drank it, and the morning moved on. The way mornings do, without ceremony, without announcement, just the quiet accumulation of one more day in which both of them had made the same unremarked decision. The last piece came in late spring. A letter, addressed to Elena, forwarded from the address on Pembridge Lane through Nathan, who had been managing a few of her father's remaining administrative threads at her request. It had been sitting in a pile of correspondence that Nathan had been working through, and he'd sent it without comment, which was his way. Her father's handwriting on the envelope. She stood in the West Wing room, her room now, with the desk by the window and the books on the shelves where they were staying, and looked at it for a long time before she opened it. The letter was 4 pages, dated 6 weeks before his death. The handwriting was careful rather than elegant, the deliberate script of a man who knew this was important and had slowed himself down for it. He told her about Marcus, about how he'd realized too late what was happening, about the payments to Greenvale, confirmation that they were intelligence fees, exactly as she'd hypothesized, paid to a contact inside Sorrell's network who'd been feeding him documentation, and he named the contact, a name she passed on to the prosecutor's office 2 days after reading the letter. About reaching out to Roland Voss and what Roland had said when he understood the full shape of what Marcus had built. About the decision to gather evidence rather than confront, because confrontation without evidence was just accusation, and Marcus had spent decades ensuring that accusations against him came with countermeasures. He told her he was sorry, not for the decisions he'd made in the years before, which he explained without excusing, the complicated truth of a man who had made choices under pressure and lived with their costs. He was sorry for how little time there was to tell her all of it properly. I was sorry that she was going to have to carry information he was giving her without the context. That context takes years to build. And then, at the end of the 4th page, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than the pages before it, she could see the change in pressure, the small unsteadiness of a man writing something he'd been working up to. He wrote, "You were always the strongest thing I built. I want you to know that I knew that, even when I made it harder for you than it should have been. The life I was able to give you was imperfect, and I was imperfect in it. But watching you become the person you became, that was not something I did. That was you, and I was very proud of it." She sat at the desk by the window for a long time. She looked at the grounds, the spring version of them, the geometry softened now, the stone walls running through grass that had come back green, the iron fence with the city visible through it, Vespera going about its ordinary business in the warm light. She didn't cry, exactly. What she did was sit with it, the letter in her hands, the ring on her finger, the room around her that was hers, the house around the room that was becoming something she hadn't planned for and didn't have a clean word for yet. She heard Adrian's footsteps in the corridor. She knew his walk now the way she knew his knock, the particular rhythm of how he moved through a space. And then the footsteps stopped outside the door. He knocked. "Come in," she said. He opened the door, looked at her face, at the letter in her hands. He didn't ask. He came in, closed the door, sat in the chair across from the desk, and waited. She didn't tell him all 4 pages. She told him the shape of it. Her father's voice through the handwriting, the explanation and the apology, and the last paragraph that she didn't read aloud, but that she held in her chest along with everything else. The weight and the warmth of it together, inseparable. When she finished, Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "He was right," he said. She looked at him. "About you." His voice was even, direct, without ornamentation. "The person you became. He was right." She looked at him across the desk. This man she'd married as a mutual act of managed suspicion, who had stood in a corridor and hit Marcus Vale with the specific fury of someone defending something he hadn't yet named out loud, who made soup wrong and let her fix it and held her hand in a library and kept his ring on in the morning without ceremony or announcement. And she felt the thing she'd been feeling for weeks finally arrive at its proper name. Not rushed there, not performed, just present in the way that real things are present when they stop being argued with. She folded the letter along its original creases and set it on the desk. "Rosamond said something this morning," she said. He waited. "She said it's the first time since she's worked here that she's heard someone laugh in this house." Elena looked at him. "She said she didn't know what to make of it." Something moved across his face, not quite the shape of a smile, but warmer than anything adjacent to it. "What did you tell her?" "I told her she'd probably get used to it." The spring light came through the window and moved across the desk and the floor, and the room that was hers in the house that was becoming theirs, and outside the iron fence. Vespera kept going the way cities do, indifferent, constant, full of its own ordinary motion. And inside, two people sat in the quiet of an ending that was also a beginning, which is the only kind of ending that costs enough to be worth it.